How many of you guys have ever been desperate before? How many of you guys have ever been desperate for something to happen? When I was in high school, I got college football tickets to go to a bowl game, and I was excited. And so I brought my brother came with, my dad came with, and we all went we headed to Detroit on a cold December day. Actually, it was night, and we made it to Detroit without a problem. We were excited to watch the game. We went and we watched the game, and we came out, and somebody left the dome lamp on in the van that we were in, which meant that we went to start the car, and the car didn't start. Now we have a problem. Like, how do we get this car started? In a sea of thousands of strangers, we are now desperate to figure out who's going to help us. So in the December cold in Detroit, we're walking to complete strangers, asking if they have jumper cables. And it was a desperate moment. And so I was like 15, 16 at the time. I was like 15 at the time. And I remember there was a second part of desperation that happened. It wasn't the fact that we didn't know how to we couldn't get home because our car didn't start, but there was another desperation deep inside of my stomach that said, I was hungry. And in that moment, it was, do we get home, or do I feed the desperation in my stomach to eat? I don't know about you, but one of those won out. And so I crept back to the van, got into the van, and thought I'll just take a little break from asking for help on how to get the van started. And I remember there's a bag of chips that was left over from the trip, so I started eating the bag of chips. And, I was a little tired from asking a lot of people for help, and so I decided, let me just lay down for a little bit. And I think in this moment, this is really what happened, that I was tipping the bag of chips back while the door opened up, and my dad greeted me. And he was like, what are you doing? Well, I said, Dad, I was hungry. So the desperation of food was a little bit more important than getting jumper cables. We got the jumper cables, no help to me, but to the help of other people, friendly people. And so we got the car started, and we got to where we needed to be, and got home safe and sound. But have you ever been desperate? Maybe you're desperate right now. Your income doesn't match the outflow, and the bills are piling up. All your friends are getting married, and you're like, woo, and you haven't even gone on a date in months. Maybe you're desperate to escape your addiction. Your kid or your grandkids are in deep trouble. Somehow you have to help them, but you desperately want to see something happen. Anything happen in your life, it's all that you can think about. If that's you, I want you to listen to today's story very carefully. See, David had many successes. He had many failures, and he also made many heartaches. And so what we're going to talk about today is not new material. In fact, some of the things we're going to talk about has come from books, come from other people's sermons. But there's an infatuation with David. In fact, in your notes, there are some books and different things places that we've gotten this material from as well. So you can look over that if you would like. But here's what we know: David, he was the guy who killed Goliath. But David was not a superhero. He was just an ordinary guy who faced a lot of the same stresses and challenges that you face and that I face today. So today we're going to learn from how David dealt with those situations and the accompanying emotions that he had with them. And before we start, let me give you a little bit of background. As a teenager, God told David through the prophet Samuel that at the right time he would be king. But God didn't tell David when that right time would be. That caused tension between the current king. Saul had no intention of stepping down. In spite of that, David had become friends with Saul and his son Jonathan. David killed Goliath and won a great victory for Israel. But what should have been a great time of celebration, quickly became a crisis. Saul became jealous of the attention that David was getting, and he decided he was going to kill David. David ran from the powerful king who was trying to kill him. David was under a lot of stress. He was anxious, he was frustrated, he was isolated, he was lonely. And also, David, instead of relying on God, decided to take things into his own hands. See, David was the guy who killed Goliath. David, the guy who had been chosen. He was protected, he was elevated, he was used by God, and he decided that God had let him down. So he came up with his own plan. And when you hear the plan, you're going to think, well, that's just stupid. Why in the world would you do that? But there's a pattern. Things people do when they're desperate. In fact, before we get to the story, that's really the first mistake that we learn from desperate people. They come up with a plan. Not God's plan, but it's their own plan. And all the emotions, the loneliness, the anxiety, the fear, the desperation, it leads them to decide, I've got something, I got to do something. From the outside looking in, it's easy to recognize if it's foolish, but when you're desperate, when you're doing something, feels like a better idea than patiently waiting on God, who doesn't seem to be doing anything. So we pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. We get to David went to Nob to Ahimelech, the priest, and Ahimelech trembled when he met him. So we're not really exactly sure why Ahimelech trembled, but it was probably because he knew that there was tension and there was a struggle. He knew the guy in front of him was the guy the king was trying to kill. So what does Ahimelech do? He asks, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? David was surrounded by soldiers and servants, but this time he's alone. And so the Ahimelech is like, why are you alone? What's going on? Where is everybody else? But what you would expect David to answer is, well, things have gone horribly wrong between me and the king. I've been faithful to him. I've been loyal to him. But now he's trying to kill me. Will you help me? That's what you'd expect to happen. But David, well, he didn't know if he could trust Ahimelech. So instead of telling him the truth, David answered Ahimelech, the priest. He says, the king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, no one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. David wasn't on a mission for the king. He was actually running from the king. David decided the truth is not going to work here, so he lied. He made up a big, fantastic story. And sometimes we go, well, I'm just telling a story. Well, that's a lie, a big lie. He wasn't on a secret mission. He was doing something else. He couldn't tell anyone about it, including you, because it's super special. It's top secret. I'm really not alone. I've got other guys. You see, they're going to meet me in a secret place, but desperation leads to deception. When we're desperate, we deceive ourselves and other people. You lie about where you've been. You lie about what you've done or what you're doing. The lie seems easy, but you get what you desperately need. Sometimes it's crazy, like David over here. Other times it's more subtle. You allow people to believe something that isn't true, which, by the way, is lying. So you adjust the records. You take a little bit of money. I'll just do this once. No one will ever know. You wear cologne to disguise the smell of alcohol. You hide a relationship you know is wrong because you don't want your friends or your pastors to know about it. You delete your search history. You have a second cell phone so no one knows about anything. You cover things up so people won't know how big of a mistake you've made and how bad it really is. You take things into your own hands, and when you do that, you take them out of God's hands. In verse 3, David continues. He says, now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David. He says, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, indeed, women have been kept from us. As usual, whenever I set out, these men are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? Now it's not just a secret mission. Now it's a secret holy mission, right? Now it just got a little bit bigger. It's a holy mission. See, your lying starts to grow. You start creating details in excess so the original lie won't be discovered. That's part of the pattern. In verse 6 it says, so the priest gave him the consecrated bread, the one who is supposed to eat. Out of fear, Abimelech fed the guy the king was trying to kill. See, David shouldn't have taken it, but his desperation overwhelmed his integrity. David put his own wants, his own needs, over what was right. And so desperation, it leads to deception. Deception erodes your sense of right and wrong. And all of a sudden, God's rules, well, they no longer apply. It's just another step in the pattern or the cycle. You decide the rules don't apply to me. See, you may be in a financial trouble, and you say, well, God's instructions regarding tithing and finances, well, that doesn't apply to me. I know what God said about this kind of relationship, but I'm exempt from that. It's okay because, after all, we're all going to be married anyway, so it doesn't really matter. It's not premarital if we're already going to get married, right? You know, you say all these things, but God knows how miserable your marriage is. God wants me to be happy, right? I deserve this. I know what the Bible says about sin, but it makes me happy. After all, God knows my heart, right? While forming your own plan, guess what? You ignore God's rules and you still expect God's blessings. It's amazing how many times people say, well, I want God's blessings. I'm like, well, how about you start living according to God? You start doing that, and then you'll find those blessings. Verse 7, it says, now one of Saul's servants was there that day. He detained before the Lord. He was Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. If this was a movie, this is when you'd hear the ominous music, letting you know something bad is about to happen. David missed the fact that Saul's most trusted servant was standing right there, was listening to the whole thing. Doeg was someone David would have recognized. But David went right on with this conversation. When you're desperate, you make dumb decisions. See, you're living in survival mode. You're thinking about what you want, what you need, the immediate future, what you want right now, without any regard to the consequences for getting caught. Again, from the outside looking in, it's obvious we want to yell, don't go in there, right? Don't make the mistake. You watch those movies and they're like, hey, I wonder what's in the barn. And you're like, no. What do? They open up and like, hey, I wonder. And you're like, oh my goodness. That's what we're doing here. We're saying, stop doing that. Don't make that mistake. Don't do that. But it's unbelievable the things people do when they're desperate. Cheating on your wife with your best friend. Eating to cover your guilt and shame, trying to cover up the money you stole from your job. Ignore the fact that you're an addict and you decide drinking alcohol is okay. It won't affect me like the drugs that I did. You get in a relationship from unhealthy people over and over and over again. You struggle with unhealthy relationships, but you find yourself in more unhealthy relationships. And you wonder, well, how is this ever going to work out? It won't. You keep doing what you know is wrong and hope that it will work out better this time. Verse 8 says, David asks Abimelech, he says, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's business was urgent. More lies. David was now being threatened. He ran off without a weapon. He realized, wait, I don't need food. I need a weapon. What was I thinking? It's just another step in the pattern. You find yourself in a situation you never expected and didn't prepare for it. So in desperation, you realize your plan wasn't a plan at all. You look around and you think, well, how did I even get here? How did this happen? David said, well, can I have a weapon? A sword or a spear? You know, like what? I need something. See, Abimelech at this point, he should have been suspicious. He's thinking, wait a minute, you're leading a secret mission, a holy mission. You didn't remember food. You didn't remember a weapon. And when he remembered one weapon, verse 9, the priest replied, he said to him, he says this, The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. If you want it, take it. There is no sword but this one. What a coincidence, right? The sword of Goliath, whom David killed. How? When he followed God's plan. It should have been like, hey, look at ding, ding, ding. God is showing up in the midst, and he's ignoring all of it, right? And I think sometimes when we're going on our own plans and we're doing things, we're like, where was God in this? And it's like, well, he's there. You just missed him. David completely missed the significance of that moment. This is what he said, there is none like it, so give it to me. In the middle of the desperate, out of control, crazy plan that he has come up with, God gave David a chance to interrupt the pattern, interrupt the cycle in our lives. The sword of Goliath was a powerful reminder of God's power that was greater than any overwhelming enemy. It was a reminder that when David was a teenager, God used him to defeat a guy that should have just taken him out with the sword. But it wasn't because of David's strength. It was because of God's strength. It was a reminder that even when you think that you're alone and when no one stands with you, you're not alone. Because Jesus says that I am with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. When Goliath held that sword and he threatened David, this is what David says. He said this, you come against me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied. All those gathered here will know. Here's the next line. It is not by the sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. Man, that's a powerful statement that we're apparently forgotten. Where was that David? This is a different David all of a sudden. David picked up the same sword, and that couldn't save Goliath, and decided, hey, this is going to help me. David took the sword that was defenseless against the power of God. Now he has a chance with a sword. So God gave David a reminder to get back to his plan, and David completely missed it. It's another part of the pattern. You forget what God has done in your past, and you ignore God's voice. You may say, well, where was God's voice? It was there. He was like, hey, here's Goliath's sword, which God helped you do that. You hear that? You're like, oh, man. But we miss it. Why do we miss it? Because we're ignoring what happened in the past. We're just thinking about the problem that we have right now. Remember, when I delivered you from that horrible financial situation, when God delivered you, you said, oh, look what I did. Remember when he set you free, you said, oh, look what I did. Remember when you escaped that relationship, you're like, it was because I did this. No, it's because God saved you and spared you. Don't you remember that? So we got to wise up. If this is your chance, you can turn around, you can change course. Now I'm the same God. Nothing has changed, but too often we think, man, look at what we did. We take all the credit, and God's going, okay. Verse 10, it says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. So, Bible historians, Gath is where Goliath was from. So the people there, the Philistines, they were David and Israel's top enemies. David went to the exact wrong people in the exact wrong place. David was traveling down a crazy, desperate path. He carried Goliath's sword into Goliath's hometown. I think that's a bad idea, okay? You just defeated Goliath, you have his sword, and now you're going into his hometown. It's kind of like, now you're rubbing it in, right? That's a bad idea. But David decided to go to people who didn't believe in the God that he was ignoring. As part of the pattern, when you're desperate, you go to the wrong people. That happens all the time. How many times have you seen desperate people go to the exact wrong person who, instead of helping them get back on track, lead them into further trouble? Addicts, they go to other addicts. Alcoholics, well, they go to the bar. People go right back into their dysfunctional, unhealthy relationship. People who are struggling in their marriage, they turn to friends who've been divorced 17 times, and they're like, well, what can you tell me? It didn't work 17 times, so what's going to happen? How's it going to save you? People who are in trouble financially go into business with people who are financially in trouble. When two people who come together, they're both disobeying God. What do you think is going to happen? I thought it would work this time. No one thought that. When you run to people who don't know God, they don't love God, or have your best interest at heart because you're desperate. In the end, that relationship is just going to be damaging and toxic. Foolish David ran to the enemy. He ran to the Philistines. In verse 11 it says, but the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one who they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? He says, hey, wait a second, isn't that David, our number one enemy? Isn't he the one that killed Goliath? In verse 12, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he killed Goliath, but now is afraid of the king. When he faced Goliath, God was on his side, but now David was on his own. So he pretended, verse 13, so he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the door of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. I mean, think about it. This is a great and mighty warrior, and he acted like he lost his mind because, guess what? He had lost his mind. He's going away from the other place. I want to make this point. The end resulting of following your own desperate plan is insanity. David isn't insane. He didn't become insane over this, but he acted insane because now he's afraid and he's doing all these things. He's not acting this way because he's following God's plan. It says, after all, David wasn't actually suffering from any mental illness. Instead, his moment was being away from God's plan for his life. See, it's a sad truth. Your plan will take you somewhere you never planned to go, and you don't want to stay there. It causes you to behave in ways that you never would have imagined, in ways that you are ashamed of to think about later. That's what sin does. It costs you more than what you want to pay and keeps you longer than you want to stay. In verse 14, it says, Achish said to his servants, look at the man. He is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen? Don't I have enough crazy guys that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? He says, look around. Half of you are crazy. Do I really need another crazy guy? Must this man come into my house? Now the story shifts from David, from his situation to Saul. In verse 16, it says, Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. And Saul, spear in hand, was seated under the tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all of his officials standing around him. Verse 7 said, Saul said to them, listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse, that's David, give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is he going to make you rich? Is David going to take care of you? Will he make you important? In verse 8 it says, is that why you have conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, none of you are concerned about me or tells me about my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today. So the king he's mad because no one's telling him what's going on. He says, you didn't tell me about Jonathan. You didn't tell me about this. I want David dead, and none of you worthless losers, are helping me kill him. Verse 9. But Doeg, he was there. Doeg the Edomite was standing with Saul's officials. He said this, I saw the son of Jesse. He came to Ahimelech at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So obviously David shouldn't have talked in front of Doeg. But here's what happens next is sad. Verse 11, then the king sent for the priest of Ahimelech and his father's whole family, who were priests at Nob, and they all came to the king. Verse 12, Saul said, listen to me now. Yes, my lord, he answered. Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me? you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and he lies in wait for me as he does today. Ahimelech answered the king. He said, who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and you're highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant of any of his father's family, for your servants know nothing at all about this whole affair. So Ahimelech, he's playing both sides at this point. When he was with David, he acted like he was on David's side. No, now he's on Saul's side. He's like, I don't know what's going on. I thought he was your guy. You're mad at him? He's like, I didn't know what you're talking about the food, the sword. I don't know about any of those things. And so he's playing both sides. And in verse 16 it says, but the king said, you will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were not willing to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Killing a priest in this time is a big deal. The guards knew it. You let God deal with God's man. If you touch God's man, then you'll answer to God. But no one moved, and the king was he was now furious. In verse 18 it says, then the king ordered Doeg. It says, you turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. And that day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Not just Ahimelech, but now 85 priests. In verse 19 he says, but he also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children, its infants, and its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. Hundreds of people died that day. Priests, women, children, even babies. The entire town was killed because of David's plan and because of David's deception. See, David had no clue that would happen. He didn't know what dads and moms and babies would. He didn't know they'd be killed. An entire village annihilated because of this crazy plan and his sin. David would have never done it if he knew the price. It's a horrible part of the pattern. It's a horrible part of the cycle that I wish I didn't have to share with you. But your consequences don't just affect you. They also affect the people around you. When you sin and take matters in your own hands and you're following your own plan, you have no idea what the long-term consequences will be. You don't know what it will cost, not only you, but the people around you. Your family is going to be devastated. Your children are going to be horribly hurt. Your sin can affect their ability to have a healthy relationship, to love and to be loved, and to follow God. People watching you decide if that's what you get for following Jesus, even though you aren't following Jesus, well, they're not interested in that. In fact, David's story indicates people you don't even know could pay the price for your rebellion. Maybe it's a friend of a friend who hears your story, or one of your kids' friends who sees how your choices affect your family. There's really knowing what your sin cost the people in your sphere of influence. If you could see the cost, you probably would never make the mistake. But you get desperate because you think, it's not happening fast enough. God's not moving fast enough. So you ignore God's plan and you come up with your own plan. You learn from the mistakes of others. Their cost should be a good clue what your cost will be. Let's let David's price serve as a warning to you. It's a sad story of one man following his own plan, and instead trusting and obeying and following God. But thank God that he gives second chances. See, in the next 4 verses, this is what we see. We see the beginning of David's road back. If you've been following your own plan and you're experiencing the consequences, here's what I want you to do. I want you to listen close, because God is a God of grace, mercy, and second chances. Verse 20 says, but Abiathar, a son of Ahimelech, escaped and fled to join David. He told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul. So you have to imagine the tears running down David's face. I'm responsible for the death of your father's whole family. See, David didn't blame Doeg for the deaths. He didn't blame Saul, but David owned it. David took responsibility. See, that's the first step to escaping this pattern or the cycle, is to accept responsibility. We live in a day and age where no one wants to accept responsibility. We're too busy pointing the finger at other people, but guess what? You're in this position because of you. So accept responsibility. Don't blame others. Don't make excuses why you can't do it. Don't try to cover it up. Don't try to add on another layer to the lie. Just own it. Own your mistakes, your failures, and the consequences. And the Bible calls that confessing. See, David said to Ahimelech's son, he said, stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who is seeking your life is seeking mine also. He'll be safe with me. David took care of Ahimelech's son for the rest of his life. David couldn't erase the consequence of his mistake, but David did what he could for who he could. If you want to escape the cycle, here's what you got to do. You got to make amends. Make a list of people who you've harmed, and wherever and however possible, you have to make it right. Then if you recognize some of these mistakes in your life, here's what you got to do. You got to break the pattern. You got to break the cycle. You just stop. That's what you do. You have to stop it. When? Well, let's stop it now. Some of you have experienced the same thing over and over and over again. You got to break the cycle. Learn the lesson. When you try to take things in your own hands, when you decide that your plan is better than God's plan, it's so predictable what happens next. It's not just in David's life you see this, but over and over and over again. As I talk to people are trying to break the cycle in their life, and they're doing so good, and then all of a sudden they're doing so good, and then people start popping up everywhere, and they're like, oh, let me just follow this plan. Let me get away from the church. Let me get away from these people. And I'm like, well, no, just get back to over here. How do we break the cycle? You break the cycle by confessing. You break the cycle by accepting responsibility. You break the cycle by breaking the pattern. And I'll add just another one, is that you stay in community with people that love you and people that will challenge you. We're not challenging you because we hate you. We're challenging you because we love you and helping you to become the person that God has.